Every AA member ought to be full, self-supporting, declining outside contributions. We will now pass the basket. This is a weekly step meeting. Our format is as follows. A speaker is asked to talk for 25 to 30 minutes on a step of that week, which is step three, followed by a discussion or questions until 7 p.m. You can find these weekly meetings on our YouTube page, the Conscious Contact Speaker Group of Doylestown. I recommend you guys. It's really, really good. You guys can sign up. It's awesome speeches. Don't forget to mash the like button and subscribe and share. That brings us to the speaker portion of the meeting on this day of, thank you, Karen, in Doylestown, PA, at Monday night, 6 p.m., Stay Alive Literature and Step Group at St. Paul's Lutheran Church. Tonight's speaker came through the wind, the storm, the rain, all the way from Doylestown, PA, and he will be sharing his experience on step three. Please help me welcome Warren.
Hi, everyone. I'm Warren. I'm an alcoholic. It's interesting. When I was driving over here, I was thinking, because I don't share a lot in meetings, and I haven't spoken in a long time, and probably maybe spoken once in the last 10 years. And you'll figure out why as I go through it. It's been a long, interesting journey to get here tonight, that's for sure. I grew up in North Jersey, so hence I'm not an Eagles fan. I'm a Giants fan. So you guys are welcome for Saquon, by the way. My upbringing, you hear it a lot, the same old thing, my dad was an alcoholic, his dad was an alcoholic, my parents were divorced, but you know what? It had nothing to do with my drinking. And, I look back on it now. Growing up, I didn't. I thought I was, it was poor me. Why didn't I have the perfect family and all that good stuff? But, looking back on it now, I said, it was a great life. I was really fortunate to grow up the way I grew up. And, I wish I had more love and, those type of things, but it just, that's not the way it was in the 70s, in the 60s and the 70s. My parents were, too busy doing what they were doing. And, but and I didn't, but from the get-go, even in my own family, I always felt like an outsider. Always felt like an outsider in everything I did. I never, and I morphed between so many different aspects of my life. I hung out with the smart kids, I hung out with the athletes, I hung out with the stoners, all that stuff because I didn't know who I was. And that followed me for a long time in my life. I just didn't, I don't remember my first drink. It was probably around when I was 16 or 17, but I do remember I liked it. And I liked the way it made me feel. And very quickly, I got to a point where it was a part of me. And so growing up in those days, it was a free-for-all in the 70s. It really was. A lot of things, but it's completely different than today. There was still an edge of innocence to it. And so, there wasn't a lot of trouble associated with it. There wasn't a lot of violence associated with it. There was a lot of craziness. But we call it innocent, but I guess. But there was, it just seemed like it was good-natured type of things. Just wanted to drink and get high and do our thing. And I looked back on it, when I was doing like my 4-step and stuff like that. Everything I did, athletically and stuff like that, I was all in individual type sports: golf, swimming, wrestling. I was never a team guy because I didn't know how to be a part of anything. I was always, an individual. And I was more self-reliant, and I didn't want to have to rely on, and I didn't want anybody to rely on me. I went down to the University of Tennessee because North Jersey kids, that's what you do. You live on the block you grow up in, and you want to get the hell out of there. And I was one of those guys that went down there, and but the thing was, I followed me, and so being a northern kid down south in the late 70s, it was interesting. It was one of the best things I ever did. But But then, all the fun wasn't fun anymore. It started becoming a burden. And I didn't realize how much of a burden it was because I just thought that's the way you live. I was controlled by the alcohol from early on. I remember I was probably 20 in college, and I knew I was in trouble. And I didn't pick up my first drink when I was 17. So I knew I was in trouble. It took me till 28 to get in here for the first time. And the car accidents, the multiple DUIs, the arrests, the ruined relationships, the family disowning you, all that stuff came on it. But all that didn't make me an alcoholic. Those are the consequences of my hard drinking. I was an alcoholic because I couldn't control my drinking, and I didn't know what was going to happen when I drank. And rarely was it good. The outcome was never really good. I had gotten, I forget what it was. It was probably my third DUI, and up in Jersey, and I had to go. This is before you went to jail for it. This is the mid '80s, and I had gone to court, and I got sentenced to probation. I didn't think it applied to me, so I didn't. You had to give urine samples, and I didn't. I wasn't very responsive to it because it was it was my world, and everybody else should respond to me. And so they violated me for not going to probation and stuff like that. And I was like, oh man, what am I going to do now? So this was 1988. I went to rehab. I thought that was the only answer because I didn't want to go to jail. And I came out of rehab in April of '88. And the first meeting I went to, my probation officer was sitting across the table from me, and he's like, "Been waiting for you." And so I had to go, paint churches and wash fire trucks and do all those things, and I stayed sober. And this is where and this is when I struggle with, does my story make sense? Because, getting to AA for the first time, it's important, but what's happened to me from when I got to AA for the first time is more important. I got here in the late '80s, stayed sober for 7 years. Went to a ton of meetings. Worked with others. Went on a ton of commitments. Half-assed the steps, but the real theme of it was I never got with God. And I'm not an atheist. I just thought God had done me wrong, and I first got, I was sober and probably, got married a year later, and right after we got married, my stepmother commits suicide, and my father dies like 2 weeks later. And I'm like, there's no God. This is the joys of sobriety. I don't want it, but I willed my way through it. And that was the theme that kept me going, was Warren will can get me through. I can power through anything. I mean, they say that alcoholics don't have willpower. We sure as hell do. I muscled my way. I was miserable. I was more miserable sober than I was drinking. I wanted to die sober. And it was because I was not willing to let go of who I was. I was full of fear, resentment, anger. I was dishonest to myself to the core. And I couldn't do the things that I needed to do. And my marriage started getting a little dicey. This is just, take it for what it is. We met in AA, so I don't know if you highly recommend. We got 3 kids out of it, and to each his own on that one. So I not only had my insanity, we had the household's insanity, and probably 7 years into this thing, I was scared to death. Life wasn't, we got married, had a child, bought a house, got a good job, all that good stuff. So, all the cash and prizes were coming my way, but Warren wasn't feeling good. I didn't feel like I had control of my life. I was scared to death that somebody was going to take it away. I thought I was a fraud. Um, and so I drank. And with that short period of time, I think I wound up within the 3-month period, I was probably in 20 hospitals, flight decks. One night I was doing something else and they had to revive me. I wake up in a flight deck with handcuffs on. So I did jails, institutions, and death in one night. Didn't learn. I was just, and the problem was because that same alcoholic who was, I couldn't control it. So the genie was out of the bottle, and I knew it. And but by the grace of God, 20 rehabs later and stuff like that, and I don't know what it was that took, but I was able to get back in here, and but I still didn't believe this was God's world. This was still Warren's world, and I tried to, and it looked good on the outside. And the problem was, the more time that I accumulated, I started wearing it as a badge, and I thought that, how do I tell people I'm hurting? How do I tell people I'm dying inside? How do I tell people that I can't live my life? How do I tell people I want to die? Because I was too proud. My self-centeredness, my ego was destroying me from inside. And so I finally, we just, we have our second child, and we, and all this time, and not to tell her story, but she had her own drama going on too. So, we were putting out two fires, and so we have the second child, and we decide that we'll move to Pennsylvania, and this was 2002. So I get sober again in '95, and I moved to Pennsylvania, and again, I'm active, I'm doing all this stuff, I do a 4-step, I make some half-ass amends, I don't take a daily inventory, but I don't believe in God. I don't believe God's out to help me. I believe that if I hold my breath and I show up to meetings every day, I'm going to stay sober. And, I convinced myself of that, and it worked. Worked for a while. I moved down here, and, I drifted away from my sponsor, and all this time I had a sponsor too. But the problem, I wasn't really telling him what the hell was going on, and I moved down here, and we kind of disconnect from my sponsor, and it's a funny thing. I've reconnected with him, 20 years later now, and start drifting away. I wasn't accountable to anybody or anything. Nobody knew who I was down here. I'd breeze into a meeting here or there, and so I get sober in '95. 16 years later, I find myself in a bar in New York, and I knew, and the whole time I was living the life that I was leading, self-will and my way of doing things. And I'm in this bar in New York, and I think it's like 2012, something like that. And I was thirsty, and I knew when I ordered that drink, and I even said to the person I was with, I said, "This is not going to end well. This is not going to end well." And she had no knowledge about my alcoholism. She knew I didn't drink, and she was normal. She didn't know that we do crazy stuff and wind up arrested and all those things. And the interesting thing was there was no DUIs behind it. There were no arrests behind it. But it picked up pace really quick, and by that time, I was retiring, so I was isolating, and I didn't think I was doing any harm, but I was. I was dying inside, and actually I got sober again on November 29, 2015, and it still chokes me up because my youngest daughter, she must have been 12 at the time. And it was right after Thanksgiving. She comes in, and she had that look in her eye, like of disgust. And I didn't lose the house. I didn't lose the money. I had retired. I'd done all those things. I wasn't, court mandated anywhere. But, all the things that had happened to me when I first came into this program 30-something years ago. And But that day I knew I lost my soul. And the power of that. And I had no intention that morning to doing anything about it. I knew I was on this glide path to hell, but I had no intention that morning of doing anything. And I went up to Karen that morning. And it's interesting. My ex-wife took me. It's crazy how this thing keeps going around. And I'm hitting the Tanqueray bottles on the ride up and all that type of stuff. And she hated me at the time, but she still took me to treatment. And lo and behold, for some reason I'm sitting in there and I'm like, how the hell did this go wrong again? And it don't, and I stopped going to meetings. I get that because I wasn't out giving of myself to somebody else. So that was the first mistake. And but the one that really struck me was I couldn't remember the last time I prayed. It'd been years that I thought of God, and I was like, wow, that's unbelievable. And even though I thought God had not given me the best hand, I believed it was coming. I knew there was a God out there, and he was sooner or later I was going to win the lottery. So I still believe. But then, when I was sitting up at Karen, I realized, like, wow, it's been a long time. I'm godless. No wonder, So I get out, and I got to tell you, it's been the last 10 years have been amazing. So, I get married, I have the baby, we buy a house, got a great job, and I drink. I get sober this time, 10 years ago, and get divorced. I retire. My brother dies suddenly. My mom dies, and I stay sober and never once thought about a drink. It's amazing. Because I had made the change, I think. And we were talking about it on a Thursday night meeting. You cease fighting everything and everyone and everything, including alcohol. And it goes on further to say, and it struck me for the first time, you don't know when that happens. And I thought about it on Thursday night. I don't know when that happened. It just happened. I had given up the fight of things. And it's interesting. I just to give me the clarity that I needed. Right after I got at Karen, I went to see some guy, because we were in divorce court, we were fighting over the kids. It was crazy, and I go see this therapist. And the thing was that the daughter that looked at me with that disgust, and my son, I was his hero, and I had disappointed him, and our relationship got real rough. He was probably 16 or 17 at the time, and I was going to see this therapist, and I was, banging on the table saying, this guy ain't listening to me, this blah, 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 and I'm going to show him, and I'm going to fix him, and so he looks me right in the eye, and all he says to me, how's that working out for you? I'm going to control everything. And at that moment, I got it. I got it. I've been fighting to control everything in my life and losing the battle every time. And, he had, for whatever, and maybe people have been telling me that all my life, like, Warren, you're just a stubborn, obnoxious person, and all you do is resist. And this guy said it in such a way where I could hear it. And today it's been a remarkable journey. It's the freedom that I always wanted, I now have. For the 35 plus years I've been around, and I didn't go too far. I went to the depths of hell, but I was still circling around this thing, and all my friends are AA people. I go on golf trips, and these are guys I've known for 30 plus years. And, so I was screwed, so I had this head full of AA. My life was surrounded by AA. And here I am trying to figure out how I'm going to, live a life of peace and freedom. And you stop fighting, and here comes the peace and the freedom. It's pretty simple, when you come to think of it. But I do have that freedom today. And I've said, life hasn't been a picnic the last 10 years. I said there's been some tough stuff. Doesn't mean that it hasn't been, it's been difficult, but I didn't have to fight the alcohol at the same time. I didn't have to fight the desire to drink. And, I do pray today. I sit here and I'm very grateful that God has blessed me with another opportunity. And over all the years, I can't tell you how many funerals I've been to. Of guys that, we've lost along the way. And all the families that have been devastated by this thing. And, the mothers and the wives and the children that you've had to hug. And I could have been one of them. And for some reason, God spared me. We hear it all the time. And, and Ron says it a lot, in the meetings. We are the very select chosen few that are sitting here. And over the time I've been around AA, back in the day we didn't have these things. We didn't have the cell phones. We had these old phone lists, and we still have them. And when we were on our last golf trip, one of the guys brought the phone list with them. 90% of the guys are dead. The other 10%, you got guys, and you got guys with 40 years, but and then you got guys that are AWOL. But it's so getting to the third step. When I finally made the decision, and I really think the decision was made for me. I was so broken, so beat up that I had, I knew I was powerless over alcohol. I knew that I was insane. I knew I had ruined other people's lives. I knew that there was some very severe defects of character, and those type of things, but I didn't put the bow on it by letting God control my life. And since then, since I've gotten, to that point, I've made the most meaningful amends in my life. Some of the character defects I'm aware of. My kids used to say to me, "Dad, you never apologize. You never say you're sorry." That's because, when you're a control freak and you're always right. That's how I lived my life. And now I'm not afraid to say I love you, or I'm sorry, or I screwed up, or I don't know what I'm doing. I had to, I had ingrained in me, you do it perfectly because people are going to laugh at you, people are going to think less of you. I already thought those things about me, and when I was drinking, I didn't have to worry about that because it all got dulled. But the life I lead today is so much better than the life I lead today, and it really is. It's uneventful. I play golf. I go to the gym. I'm not working. I got grandkids now. It's really simple. It's drama-free. The ex-wife invites me over for dinner. She comes to my house for Christmas. It's bizarre. Some people who know the two of us can be, over the years. And you know what? She's the mother of my children. And, my world's pretty small. So why am I going to jettison people that actually cared about me at some point in their life? So, I need that type of stuff. And I need people in my life who are going to say, and they're just going to, and I got, the guy I'm working with is real simple. Everything comes back to the 12 steps. I got drama in my life or something like that. And I don't have a lot of drama, but every time I bring something up that I'm struggling with, it's, do you need to make an amends? How's your inventory? Are you getting with God? It's not psychobabble. It's about recovery. So that's where I am. That's how I got here. And I am really grateful to God that He's allowed me multiple attempts at this thing. And I sit here, and I am free. And there is no better feeling, and it's I don't have all of the bells and whistles going on in my life. I don't have the job that's patting me on the ass saying how great I am, and and the kids are older. They're raising their own families and stuff now. It's so it's nice. It's just nice, and the fact that I've gotten to this point, you know, gives me like, okay, when we go on these golf trips, it's guys who've been sober a long, long time, and you know, it's like, you know, we're all at this point in life, and it's like, it's the glory days. You know, we're living the glory days, and it's because of God that, you know, and the fact that Warren got out of God's way to let God do what God had to do with Warren. And some days, you know, I don't get pissed off anymore when I get cut off. I don't, you know, you know, somebody wants to cut me off in a store. I don't care. Where am I going? What's my rush today? I got nowhere to go, you know. So it's just like, I used to take everything so seriously. My kids say, Dad, you know, is there anything that you give a crap about? Because I really, and that's not me. That I didn't sit there and wake up one day and say, I'm going to start caring about the stuff that used to bother me. God removed that from me, you know, but I had to be willing to allow those things to change. And because I was willing to do that, the desire and the obsession to drink was lifted. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. It's now to the point of the meeting where we're going to share. Do the best you can to have your sharing. It's going to be related to step 3. If you feel like drinking, or if you have had a drink, please see me or speak to someone after the meeting. We ask that you please refrain from the use of profanity. We are in church and on a spiritual journey. What I'd like to do now is open up the meeting, but I'd like to start because I